How do modern hybrid funding instruments, such as unitranche debt or debt with equity warrants, blur the traditional lines between debt and equity?
The spectrum of capital now includes instruments such as unitranche debt and maybe debt with equity warrants, or maybe equity with yields attached to them. Effectively, there's very little difference between a loan where you have to give up 20% of your business and potentially pay a 15% interest rate versus an equity instrument where you have to pay a 15% yield and give up 20% of your business. So this sort of comes back to the point that capital is a spectrum, and we should focus less on the words debt and equity and what the individual characteristics are of that particular instrument. It does also make it much harder to compare apples to apples when you're actually looking at different facilities, and therefore getting professional advice will help you unpick the differences between what you're being offered.
What is the primary factor that determines whether a business needs invoice financing versus patient capital for long-term expansion?
The spectrum of capital has a balance of risk, cost, and amount of control that you concede. Invoice discounting is generally going to be cheaper than some sort of unitranche credit. However, there may be differences in flexibility or repayment profiles. Invoice discounting is quite closely aligned to your working capital cycle, and therefore it certainly helps businesses that are going to grow rapidly, whereas unitranche credit might be based over a repayment profile or even back-ended with interest only. So there's a real mix, and it does depend on the circumstance of the business in terms of how much cash flow you need to generate growth versus how much funding you need to fund your working capital cycle. So there are a lot of factors to take into account, and the best type of facility might not always be the cheapest facility.
How should a business's risk appetite, specifically in terms of maintaining control versus accelerating expansion, dictate its choice of funding option?
Different funders will have different appetites. Typically what you consider debt financing will be backwards looking, and therefore they will want to know that what the sustainable EBITDA of the business is for funding. Some of those equity funders might be more forward looking, and some of those mezzanine funders might be more forward looking. Those forward looking funders will be looking at your expansion growth and so on and so forth. So in terms of where your business position is today versus where it's going to be in the future will largely dictate who's going to be the most appropriate funder for you.
When does venture debt become a relevant option? And what is the typical trade-off compared to pure equity dilution?
So for a business that's first starting out, the first round is usually called the seed round or the friends and family round, and that is traditionally very hard to raise from institutional capital. As then you've got a business that starts to generate revenue, those businesses then can start to raise money from institutional investors through Series A and Series B and Series C. Typically around Series B, where the business is starting to approach break even, there might be venture debt options available. That again sits further up the risk spectrum, so you will have slightly lower risk and therefore slightly lower costs and slightly less control exerted by those funders. In terms of what venture debt looks for, typically they want a business with some form of intellectual property, they want a business that has got a route to profitability, and they want somebody to have previously invested in the business.
Beyond strong financials, what internal business characteristics, such as management team bandwidth, existing stakeholder relationships, must be assessed before pursuing complex funding structures?
Every single funder will look for a balance of three things. They will look for the management and the controls in the business, they will look at the financial situation of the business, and they will look at the security, which is how they get their money back if something goes wrong. In terms of that, different funders will prioritise those in different orders, but effectively one thing that is within your control is the management team and those internal controls. So being able to evidence good corporate governance, being able to evidence good KPIs, good management reporting, those will help you get funding which is classed as lower risk and therefore lower cost.